Good afternoon, everybody. It's lovely to see you all here today. My name is Andrew Holmes. I'm Head of History here at Queen's, and it gives me great pleasure to invite you, or to welcome you all to the University and to the Keith Jeffery Annual Lecture in Public History. The lecture is organised as part of an annual conference run by the Centre for Public History under the leadership of Professor Alwyn Purdue. The Centre's engagement with the meaning and practice of public history is clear in the timely theme for this year of this year's conference, Public History in an Age of Anxiety. The delivery of this excellent programme has been the responsibility of my colleagues, and it's my pleasure to thank publicly for all their hard work, Alwyn Purdue, Niamh Cullen, Leonie Hannon, and especially Isa Strephuter. I think I've got that right. I should also say that you're all more than welcome after the lecture to come with us to the Naughton Gallery, where there will be a wine reception and we can continue our conversations. Professor Margaret Macmillan of the University of Oxford delivered the first Keith Jeffery Annual Lecture in 2016. Since then, our guest lecturers have come from a variety of institutions, including the Smithsonian, University College London, and the University of Michigan, and have addressed topics of enduring and contemporary significance. I want to extend a warm welcome to our lecturer for this year, Professor Ludmilla Jordanova, who will shortly be introduced to you. The Keith Jeffery Lecture is named after a much loved and much respected colleague who died too soon in February 2016. Keith was a first-rate historian, colleague, friend, and family man. Keith combined scholarly precision and rigour with an enormously attractive humanity. As one colleague remarked, Keith proved that you can be a great scholar and a really nice person. We're delighted that many of his family and friends have joined us today, including Sally, Ben, Alex and Hannah, Brian, Odile, Jeanette and Joyce. Keith was born in Belfast and educated across the road at Methodist College. He then pursued his undergraduate and postgraduate study at Cambridge University, where, more significantly, he met Sally. In 1978, Keith began his career at the Ulster Polytechnic, which became a constituent part of the University of Ulster in 1985, before coming to Queen's as Professor of British History in 2005. His only misstep in his many years at Ulster University was to appoint me to my first academic post in 2002. Keith has a global reputation as a historian of the military, of Ireland, and of the secret world of intelligence gathering. This is reflected in a range of books, including The British Army in the Crisis of Empire, A Military History of Ireland, which he co-edited with Tom Bartlett, Ireland in the Great War, and his biography of Field Marshal Sir Henry Wilson. In 2005, he was commissioned by the British Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, to write an authorised history for the organisation's centenary. Keith was given unrestricted access to files from its founding in 1909 through to 1949. He knew the real James Bond, but he certainly never told me who it was. The fruits of his research were published by Bloomsbury in 2010 as MI6, The History of the Secret Intelligence Service. His final book, published in 2015, was 1916, A Global History, which looked at how 12 events from different arenas of war, including the Easter Rising, reverberated around the world. During his career, he received various academic honours, including his election to the Royal Irish Academy and an honorary Doctor of Letters from the University of Cambridge. Keith loved his subject, and his engagement in public history was a natural outgrowth of his enthusiasm. He frequently addressed local history groups, professional bodies and student societies, as well as writing and presenting the Australian television documentary Revealing Gallipoli. He would often talk about the process of making that series, and one who heard him speak at an event in Dublin recalls, this was a time before impact became just another measurement of academic performance. It was clear Keith was doing this because of his love for the subject and the joy it brought him to communicate to a broader audience. I well remember the glee our school manager, who's with us today, Frances Mercer, had when she reported on the number of media hits registered by Keith's history of MI6 that swamped by a ridiculous factor any other news emanating from this university. Yet to focus solely on academic contribution would be to miss the significance of Keith as a generous, entertaining, convivial and supportive teacher, colleague, friend and relative. Food, wine and conversation indelibly mark our memories of this wonderful individual who led a full life and allowed others to experience the same. We very much miss Keith, but we're honoured that we have this lecture to remind us of his wonderful life and his contribution to our lives and to this university. I now invite my colleague, Alwyn Purdue, to introduce our Keith Jeffery Lecturer for 2025. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And it now gives me very great pleasure to introduce this year's Keith Jeffery Lecturer in Public History, Professor Ludmilla Jordanova. It feels almost redundant to be introducing her to a room full of public historians. Having spent many years now marking essays on the MA in Public History, I now have to beg my students, please don't start your essay as Professor Ludmilla Jordanova has argued, but they still do. And to be honest, with very good reason. Professor Jordanova has long been and remains a leading scholar of public history, as well as a hugely influential figure in the history of science and medicine and in visual culture. Professor Jordanova has been Professor Emeritus of Visual Culture in the Department of History at Durham University since 2019. Educated at Newhall, Cambridge, she taught at the Universities of Oxford, Essex, York, Cambridge, where she was director of the Centre for Research in the Arts, Social Sciences and Humanities, or CRASH, as it was known. East Anglia, where she was Professor of Visual Arts, and King College London as Professor of Modern History. She moved to Durham University in 2013 and 2 years later became Director of the University's Centre for Visual Arts and Culture. Professor Jordanova is the author or editor of 12 books. Is that right? Oh, you don't know? Well, that says it all, including the hugely influential History and Practice, which I think is now in its 3rd edition, and more recently, The Look of the Past. She's also authored dozens of articles and chapters. She served as the president of the British Society for the History of Science and the History of Science section of the British Association for the Advancement of Science. Until 2021, she was trustee of the Science Museum Group and chaired the Locomotion Advisory Board. She's been trustee of Mahogany Opera Group and a member of the advisory board of the About Face research project at the University of York. Professor Jordanova, Ludmilla, is no stranger to us at Queen's either. Indeed, it's very fitting that she should be here this evening to give this annual Keith Jeffery Lecture because she, like Keith, was foundational to public history at Queen's. Going back now almost a decade to the time when the idea of a research and teaching focus on public history was being discussed and proposed, and sometimes it seemed like we weren't getting very far. 2 eminent, highly respected scholars and senior academics, Professors Keith Jeffery and Ludmilla Jordanova, constantly encouraged me and persuaded me that this was a good idea and something worth pursuing. And coming from 2 of the finest examples there are of a good public historian. That was encouragement indeed. In 2016, Ludmilla paid her first visit to Belfast to give a keynote lecture at a wild symposium on heritage and public history, organised myself and Dr. Leonie Hannon. It may have been her first visit, but it certainly wasn't her last. The next year, I think you returned at 2017, and we ran a 3-day workshop for doctoral students on dealing with troubled pasts. And in that, we explored and reflected on the relationship between how the past is presented and the various actors in such presentations, particularly in difficult or challenging contexts, on the role of the professional historian, the participant, the audience, and the dynamics at play in the space between those groups. It was at this event that Professor Jordanova advocated for qualities that I have come to understand as being foundational components of good public history. Emotional intelligence, self-awareness, as we heard earlier, reflexivity, contextualization, and sound judgment. I remember Professor Jordanova saying, the more ambiguous and multifaceted the issue, the greater the need for meticulous judgment about context. In this age of anxiety, when judgment seems to have maybe gone out the window, these are qualities that we, as scholars, as historians, need to nurture more than ever in ourselves and in the generation of historians that are coming after us. In this afternoon's lecture, Professor Jordanova turns her attention to portraits as public history, to national portrait galleries in particular, as significant sites of public history that speak directly into this age of anxiety. Professor Jordanova.
Olwen, thank you for your very generous introduction. Well, it's a very great pleasure to deliver this lecture to honour the memory of Keith Jeffery, whom I was fortunate to have known, and I'm very grateful and give my heartfelt thanks for the invitation. I think we can... Between the 2nd and the 9th of March 1919, a prominent military man and a well-known artist met at the Versailles Peace Conference, and their encounter resulted in this portrait that the sitter disliked intensely. The work in question entered London's National Portrait Gallery in 1960, where other paintings and several photographs of Field Marshal Sir George Wilson, as well as numerous works by the artist William Orpen, may be found. And of course, both men were Irish, if in complicated ways. The genesis of the portrait is described in Keith Jeffery's wonderful biography of the controversial soldier, which was published, as we heard, in 2006. And this likeness speaks to my themes today in what I hope are revealing ways. Portraiture and biography are intricately interwoven genre, and they are prominent in forms of history that reach wide audiences. Furthermore, they have usually been explicitly forged with that very aim in mind, and hence they speak to public history in its full range of meanings. The work of William Orpen, I was going to just remind you about the book. The work of William Orpen, who was born in the Dublin area in 1878 and died in London 52 years later, neatly illustrates the ways in which portraits were made to communicate with the public and thereby become capable of helping us to reflect on the nature of public history. His artistic activities during and immediately after the First World War, together with his memoir, An Onlooker in France, first published in 1921 with a second edition in 1924, and extensively illustrated with his own work, are especially noteworthy. And I'm just going to show you, this is from the first edition, and this is the preface that I'm going to come on to in a second. The book is full of verbal and visual vignette, where in a few strokes he sums up the character and demeanour of those he encounters, treating them rather like cases in medical contexts. More generally, Orpen's images and words constitute a commentary on the war, exploring themes that were taken up in popular culture and that remain resonant to this day. His admiration for, even idealization of, the ordinary soldier is perhaps the most striking example. As he says in the preface to Onlooker, which you have before you, the only thought I wish to convey is my sincere thanks for the wonderful opportunity that was given me to look on and see the fighting man and to learn to revere and worship him. That is the only serious thing. Orpen's account also expresses disdain for some of the officers he encountered and for those politicians he called the frocks. In doing so, he was articulating sentiments that have found expression in plays and films, novels and poetry, as well as historical writings of all kinds. But at the same time, he also made many portraits of senior figures along the way, men who held prominent positions whom he sought to render sympathetically, and such likenesses, including the one of Henry Wilson, invite our careful consideration. And this is Henry Wilson as he appears in Onlooker. Now, Orpen is a complex figure, I think, not least in his relationship with Ireland and all it stood for. And today, I want to draw attention to his portraits. He was, after all, a prominent and very successful portrait painter, and by virtue of that, a public figure in his own right. Now, I want to draw attention to his portraits because this category of art is made with a view to providing some kind of enduring testimony to the existence of a specific person. My point is that both portrait making and portrait displaying are forms of public history. Starting from the very moment of an image's inception, likenesses generate multiple, never-ending layers of reaction and interpretation. The success of national portrait galleries, as well as of blockbuster exhibitions dedicated to portraitists, provide supporting evidence. By their very nature, such institutions have to deal with difficult and divisive issues, including those connected with military activities, broadly defined. And of course, each national portrait gallery will deal with them in their own distinctive way. Beyond national organizations, the ways in which portraits are used in publications and websites reveal what is commonly taken for granted, that they affirm the existence of a historical actor, even when minimal information is given. Viewers bring much with them, of course, so that portraits invite projection. These dynamics are inevitable. They certainly complicate public reactions, which are themselves useful evidence for public historians. We might say that portraits work hard, despite the fact that we sometimes take them for granted, treating them as a sort of wallpaper. So our job as historians is to trace and interpret such ubiquitous phenomena, and in doing so, it may be helpful to think of portraits and biographies, as I already hinted, as akin to cases in medicine, unfurling the distinctive features of specific people in order to understand them better, but also allowing us to move on to more general reflections about human experience. In starting with William Orpen's depiction of Field Marshal Sir Henry Wilson, born in Longford in 1864 and assassinated on the 22nd of June 1922, shortly after he had become the Conservative MP for North Down, I can both pay tribute to Keith Jeffery and allude to broader points about the codependence of portraiture and biography and their roles in public history. For example, I think it's of considerable interest that a popular weekly magazine gave over many pages to Wilson's death and funeral. And I'm just going to show you some examples of this. I mean, it seems to me that the kind of coverage rather implies that this is equivalent to a monarch being buried. Now, this treatment included a large photograph of Wilson, which was published in The Graphic, the magazine in question, with a highly emotive caption less than 2 weeks after his death. And I don't know if you can read that, but the caption reads, "This admirable portrait of the great soldier who was so fiendishly done to death by Irish assassins as he was about to enter his house in Eaton Place on returning from Liverpool Street Station, where he had unveiled a memorial to railwaymen who fell in the war, is by Walter Stoneman, FRPS. Now, published material like this indicates how words plus image compress historical complexities for general audiences, still, of course, a prevalent practice a century later. And this material shows in miniature how lives and likenesses were inextricable from the public representation of the war, and as I keep stressing, constitute historical evidence in their own right. Now, the ways in which military activities, the conduct and nature of warfare are understood by publics, both at the time and subsequently, is certainly a significant matter. And hence there's another theme that I'd wish to consider, namely the position and status of military history in historical practice and among audiences, which I observe to be far from straightforward. Keith Jeffery's impressive body of publications, such as Ireland and the Great War of 2000 and 1916, A Global History, published in 2015, help us with that too. And I would like to say that I think the 1916 book is especially notable because it has this feature of the 12 chapters mirroring the calendar year. And I think that's such a brilliant idea, and I've not seen it used anywhere else. And in saying all this, actually, I have not forgotten our conference theme, Public History in an Age of Anxiety, which I will come to in a moment. Now, any given portrait implies a life story, and it's customary to provide biographical details of sitters, however brief, when portraits are displayed in museums, galleries, libraries, and the public areas of institutions. Sometimes these are just dates of birth and death, together with a name. And portraits are to be found in every form of culture, serving both to assert the actual existence of a person and to imply their individual life narrative. And it's precisely because portraits are ubiquitous that it is all too easy to pass over their significance for those immediately involved in their creation and for all who encounter them subsequently. Even if made in familial contexts, they could have a public function when displayed in stately homes and palaces, for example, and then acquire fresh public significance with their display in museums and galleries. When their original context of production has been modest, even intimate, they may well have an enhanced capacity to touch public sensibilities. And this is, I think, a very interesting example. So we might think of George Rumney's many portraits of Emma Hamilton, the mistress of Admiral Lord Nelson, with whom the artist himself was smitten. Now, I am well aware of the complexities of public as a concept. Naturally, it is part of the duty of public historians to bear them in mind and to explore the numerous nuances of public. In fact, the varied contexts of the production, use, and display of portraits may be especially helpful in doing so. From one-to-one encounters recorded in letters and diaries, to book covers and illustrations, from exhibitions and lectures to postcards and journal articles, from laptops and websites to posters, newspapers, and magazines, portraits are perpetually present, prominent, and on the move, seen by diverse audiences in a range of settings. But here I want to mention a further dimension of public, namely that which pertains to the nation. So national portrait galleries display likenesses of people who are relevant to that particular type of political entity. And we see this clearly in the case of Walter Stoneman, whom I mentioned a few moments ago. He photographed Wilson, but he also founded the National Photographic Record in 1917 in collaboration with the National Portrait Gallery. And it's estimated that it contains 80 admirals and 100 generals. Thousands of his portraits may be found on the NPG website. And what you're seeing in front of you is his 1942 self-portrait. Now, while nationhood is a complex and contested phenomenon, we tend to agree on the importance of delineated borders and on the right to defend them. Those who lead such entities, heads of state, whether elected or simply there by virtue of inheritance, intertwined as they are with defending the realm, are prime candidates for inclusion in national portrait galleries, as are those who actually direct military activities, doing so on behalf of king and country. Accordingly, we would expect military portraits to be central to such collections. And that indeed was the expectation during and immediately after the First World War. The Imperial War Museum, which was set up in March 1917 to record experiences of war, contains many portraits of prominent military figures, while the London Portrait Gallery, founded in 1856, commissioned 3 paintings of leading figures in the Army, Navy, and politics, respectively, during the First World War. So Henry Wilson appears in John Singer Sargent's General Officers of World War I, completed in 1922 and currently on public display. I should say that the Wilson portrait is not on public display at the moment. And I actually can't imagine any circumstances really in which it would now be displayed, which is one of the themes I'm trying to get at. So, as I say, I'm stressing these points because in the 21st century and a war-torn world, it is striking that it no longer seems self-evident, at least to many people, that senior military figures should be the subject of portraits that are prominently displayed in national institutions. But in the worlds of Wilson and Orpen, portraits, nations, and military activities were inextricably linked in public culture. Now, I think William Orpen's life between 1917 and 1921 neatly illustrates these points. He travelled fairly freely in France, sketching and painting more or less as he pleased. He had friends in high places and did not hesitate to enlist them in his support when he encountered obstacles. He was frequently asked to make portraits, and in May 1918, an exhibition of 50 oil paintings and 70 drawings at Agnew's in London allowed British audiences to view his work. And organised by the Ministry of Propaganda, it was subsequently shown in Manchester and the United States. Orpen decided to give this war work to the nation, and it is now held in the Imperial War Museum, which has more work by Orpen than those shown in the original show. But on a recent visit there, I could not find a single one of Orpen's works on display. 20 years ago, the Imperial War Museum dedicated an exhibition to him, and it was revealingly subtitled Politics, Sex, and Death. And I think it's revealing because I think it's trying to recast Orpen's war work in a way that seems alluring to a 21st century audience. Now, this exhibition did include some of his portraits, the portraits of Haig and Foch, as well as his much lauded 1916 painting of Winston Churchill, and this exhibition travelled to Dublin in the same year. An exhibition to mark the centenary of Orpen's birth had been mounted in Dublin in 1978. His war work is sometimes reproduced in publications about the arts in the early 20th century. A detailed biography of him was published in 1981. The National Portrait Gallery and Tate each owns 29 works. Now, Orpen was not only a portraitist, and his output during the Great War included landscapes and scenes with figures who are not specifically named. Even before the war, he was more than a portrait painter. Nonetheless, his connections with prominent people and the fact that he produced about 600 portraits over his lifetime have led to him being associated with social and political elites, and hence, it seems, as somehow inauthentic. Secondary sources tend to cast him somewhat dismissively as, quote, a society painter in cahoots with the establishment, and stress the large amount of money he made from his portrait practice, as if this somehow diminishes his historical and aesthetic importance. Furthermore, since he cannot be claimed for modernism, he is easily seen as having been old-fashioned in his own time, further evidence of his lack of authenticity. And then the status of portraiture as art is itself precarious, unless undertaken by an acknowledged master. So by extension, there are scholars who, considering that studying portraits is beneath them. The very designation, society painter, hints at flattery and conventional approaches, that is, at contrived, inauthentic work. Now, authenticity, its construction and perception, is a major concern within public history. And it is, I think, significant that the Imperial War Museum in London emphasises the experience of war, not just for participants, but for those left behind. And over time, there is ever less prominence given to what could be construed as, quote, elites. For example, there is a huge display of a reconstructed home there at the moment, using the memories of someone who was familiar with it to stress the nature of ordinary life in the Second World War. Now, Orpen and Wilson do not fit comfortably into this approach. Now, of course, there is another aspect to authenticity that comes up in this highly specific conjunction of artist and soldier, who, by the way, had met in Ireland long before the war, and that is their Irishness. Now, Orpen moved to England in 1897. He studied at the Slade School of Art in London and spent most of his life in the metropolis. Until the First World War, he returned to Ireland on a regular basis, and a shift, I think a decisive shift occurred when he decided to enlist in the British Army at the very end of 1915. And this was, as I've said, a decision of some significance, and some of his Irish friends tried to persuade him not to enlist and to actually defect to Ireland, and he absolutely refused. Orpen then went to France in the role of a war artist in April 1917. Yet in 1924, he published a book called Stories of Old Ireland and Myself. And this, I'm going to show you just a couple of examples from the book. This is a short, illustrated, anecdote-filled volume, perhaps designed to make a public statement about his relationship with his native land, to affirm some kind of affinity while voicing criticisms, especially of members of Dublin society in his younger days, and above all, of the art establishment there. So this book might be interpreted as performing Irish authenticity in a melancholy and nostalgic key. And authenticity in general was certainly a thread running through the art produced during the war to convey its realities. And we might think, and here I'm going to show you some examples of Orpen's work, of Blown Up, which you're seeing in two versions, one from the book and one from the Imperial War Museum website. This is from 1917. A Skeleton in a Trench, this is from the book. Dead Germans in a Trench, and Zonnebecker, also from the Imperial War Museum. Those are both from 1918. So what I'm suggesting here is that these works resonate better with our current sensibilities about war in general and about the First World War in particular. And I think it's far harder for us to respond with curiosity or sympathy to the portraits of major figures from the armed forces, such as General Sir John Cowan's, this is again from Onlooker, or Baron Wester Weems, Cowan's 1916, Weems from 1919. But I don't want to dismiss or ignore such works. Rather, let's acknowledge that there is something that invites our attention here. The conjunction of portraiture and military men and their roles, whether actual or potential, is, I think, capable of speaking, and speaking eloquently, to the public understanding of the past. Now, it is possible that such images command so little sympathy that working out why may not even seem worth the effort. But I think there is much here for public historians to consider. Given how polarizing armed conflict is, and the suspicion with which military power is viewed by some, but lauded by others. Now, an obvious issue here is gender and its cultural representation. Another is the status and roles given to military leaders. And a further one is the strikingly broad appeal of military history. Indeed, I think we should be asking what military history actually refers to and assessing its position in public culture, as well as charting the forms it takes, including in life writing. Now, it's abundantly clear that military history is popular. A glance at the shelves of bookshops, at films, at television schedules, to say nothing of the range of magazines, games, and toys with military themes, confirms the point. Yet in speaking to academic colleagues, I have noticed that the phrase military history often prompts disdain for the nerdy enthusiasms about weapons and battles it is assumed to refer to. I was at a party recently with a lot of historians who were colleagues of mine at King's College London, and so I did a quick survey of them, and they did indeed confirm that that was their immediate reaction. Since military history, however we define it, forms a major element within the myriad versions of the past that are presented to the public, we need to look it in the face. And biography in its turn is an important genre within military history. Hence, portraiture too must have its place. And since military portraits tend to feature men, it might be thought that there is little to say about gender, which is, after all, a comparative phenomenon, with forms of masculinity and femininity being constantly defined and redefined in relation to one another. But here we might just want to know what I think is a very striking portrait. This is Orpen's portrait from 1918 of the woman who was the WRAF commandant, who was a scientist, had an extraordinarily interesting history. Within masculinity, however, there are many different types existing in dynamic relationships with one another. Orpen's war portraits arguably explore styles of masculinity at a specific historical moment, seeking to convey the human qualities in each individual. And I actually take them to be a form of compassion, not despite the circumstances in which they were made, but precisely because of them. And I want to suggest that this is not so much about how much he liked his sitters, although that too must be taken account of, but about his understanding of their wartime existence. And I think this is, in fact, a general feature of portraiture, that through their interactions with sitters, artists come to deposit in visual form their grasp of the sitter and their circumstances. And they do this in such a way that viewers can share that understanding. Now, of course, misunderstandings do occur in the making as in the reception of portraits. But in day-to-day life, every single person acquires visual repertoires that help them function. And these are put to work, often semi-consciously, when they find themselves in front of a portrait. The notion I use to express this phenomenon is somatic affinity. That is, the ability that we have as embodied creatures to respond to and interpret others, and it is upon this that the genre of portraiture rests. And of course, it hardly needs saying to this audience that, of course, most popular histories trade on this very phenomenon. At the same time, we recognize that diverse reactions are not just possible, but occur frequently. So I recently showed Orpen's portrait of Wilson to someone who knows present-day military life well. And her immediate response was telling, we were sitting on a train, actually, and got talking. And she told me that her husband had been a very senior officer in the army. So, of course, I do what one would do and whipped out an image of Orpen's portrait of Wilson to see what she thought about it. And what she said immediately was, oh, it's a caricature. Now, I think this reaction perhaps chimes with Wilson's dislike of the image, and indeed with a controversy that enveloped this 1909 work by Orpen when it was acquired by the National Portrait Gallery in 1932. The artist had died on the 29th of September the previous year. It was claimed that Orpen had caricatured those depicted in the selecting jury of the New English Art Club, and hence was disrespectful. There is no doubt that the artist readily turned to humor, including making fun of himself, and he's the person in this canvas sporting a yellow waistcoat. And that Orpen's very capacity for humor rendered him suspect in some quarters. But I actually think his capacity for humor is one of the things that we will want to interpret. Now, I confess to you that I am not quite sure how to interpret Orpen's rendering of Wilson, which is rather different from his portraits of other military bigwigs. In Onlooker, he acknowledges that the sitter was unhappy with the likeness, adding, and I quote, "With all his fun, Sir Henry was a deep thinker and towered over the majority of the frocks by his personality, big outlook, and clear vision." So one way forward is to make comparisons with Orpen's other work, as well as to explore other depictions of the field marshal, such as these in London. The first and earlier, that's just Orpen again. The first is an earlier work which depicts Wilson by English Sheldon Williams, very interesting artist who was both a soldier and a journalist illustrator during the Boer War, and as you can see, was signed and dated by both artist and sitter. And the second, which I think is a truly extraordinary canvas, actually, a preparatory study by John Singer Sargent for his large general officers canvas that you saw a few moments ago. And this was made sometime between 1919 and 1922, so likely, I think, after Orpen's portrait of Wilson. To compare the portrait of Wilson with Orpen's contemporaneous canvases, it is plausible to take, for instance, his portrait of Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig, made in May 1917. Haig, like Sir John Cowans, was already known to Orpen, and Haig was actually a strong supporter of Orpen's war work and constantly was affirming the value of having artists making a record of the war. And here is Orpen's own account of Haig in Onlooker. and I quote, "Sir Douglas was a strong man, a true northerner." That's a reference to the fact that Haig was born in Edinburgh. "Well inside himself, no pose. It seemed it would be impossible to upset him, impossible to make him show any strong feeling, and yet one felt he understood, knew all, and felt for all his men that he truly loved them, and I knew they loved him. Never once, all the time I was in France, did I hear a Tommy say one word against Haig," with an apostrophe. "Whenever it became my honor to be allowed to visit him, I always left him feeling happier, feeling more sure that the fighting men being killed were not dying for nothing. One felt he knew and would never allow them to suffer and die except for final victory. When I started painting him, he said, 'Why waste your time painting me? Go paint the men. They're the fellows who are saving the world, and they're getting killed every day.'" Now, of course, there's much to unpack here, including Haig's, of course, very mixed reputation. But depictions of him, I think, actually provide a compelling way into this unraveling, while inviting us to explore the quality of relations between Haig and those who served under him, and it is striking that Orpen describes them in terms of love. Now, the National Portrait Gallery owns 64 images of Haig. These include many photographs and prints, but they also include a postcard with embroidery, a hand-colored mug, and a cigarette card. And these, I think, along with all the others, suggest something of his level of popularity. I don't know if you want me to be explicit about the dates, but the embroidered card is from during the war. The mug is from 1919, but the card is from 1926. Now, I don't think it's necessary to buy into forms of heroization in order to find them indicative of broader historical phenomena that can be rendered accessible to wide audiences through portraiture, taking up thereby the very themes they were originally intended to convey, but given fresh depth and bite by our critical understanding of the ways in which portraiture constructs and promulgates forms of identity. Thus, portraits of elite military figures actually offer rich opportunities for examining difficult and violent pasts, for reflecting on the relationships between hierarchical levels in military organizations, and for exploring their roles in conflicts in more nuanced terms. There's a huge secondary literature on Haig, but so far as I've been able to discover, little discussion of his portraiture. So if someone here knows otherwise, please correct me about this. And I want to stress here that I am not myself approving of or liking figures such as Wilson, Haig, and Orpen. Rather, I am noting their analytical potential for us and their accessibility for wide audiences. Now, so far, I have emphasized artists and sitters associated with the First World War in line with Keith Jeffery's own scholarship. But the theme of this conference derives from the aftermath of the Second World War, since the phrase Age of Anxiety is associated with W.H. Auden's 1947 poem, and this is Auden in 1947. The poem is set in New York, where Auden had lived since 1939, and it is also associated with Leonard Bernstein's Second Symphony, which was directly inspired by the poem, also called The Age of Anxiety, and first performed on April the 8th, 1949. Auden's long poem was set during the war with one of the four characters, a sailor. And since then, a diverse array of publications have used the idea. Sarah Dunant and Roy Porter's edited volume for example, from 1996, I think the cover itself is fairly anxiety-inducing, links the age of anxiety with the imminent millennium, perhaps revealing an ever-increasing interest since the early 20th century in mental conditions, in psychology and psychoanalysis, and in the capacity of these fields to explain broad phenomena of interest to historians and to their diverse audiences. And I think a comparison between Age of Anxiety and Great Depression could be fruitful. The latter term was already in use in the early 1930s. Now, the term anxiety is currently so commonly used that we may be forgiven for thinking it has lost much of its meaning. It remains, however, a clinical condition. See the NHS website on, quote, generalized anxiety disorder, where many of the main symptoms listed, such as difficulty sleeping, low mood, inability to concentrate, restlessness, and irritability, became familiar when soldiers returned from the Great War and shell shock was beginning to be named, which happened in 1915 and then extensively studied. The NHS site also mentions panic disorder and phobias. Now, much has been written about the aftermath of the two world wars, including in the form of film, fiction, and film scripts that explores just these sorts of anxieties. Now, despite its current widespread, even casual use in everyday life, I'd like to suggest that the connections between anxiety, conflict, and war are inescapable. In other words, talking about military portraits is quite apt for a conference that has Age of Anxiety in its title. Now, visual artists fully participated in these trends, as we saw in some of Orpen's depictions that I showed a little while ago. There is indeed a question to be considered about the ways in which the visual arts respond to, express, and mediate these broader trends. It might be argued that Orpen's perceived flippancy, whether visual, verbal, or behavioural, was a response to the age of anxiety in which he lived successively in Ireland, in London, and in France, where he spent longer than any other war artist. Of course, humour was not his only response, and using the example of Field Marshal Douglas Haig, I argued just now that Orpen attempted to capture his humanity in paint and was struck by the mutual love between him and those who served under him. And I acknowledge that we now recognise just how controversial he was, even if he was constantly presented to the public in heroic terms. So it's essential for us now to avoid replicating those idioms associated with heroes and villains, instead finding ways of exploring historical complexities, communicating those complexities with as wide and diverse audiences as possible, while explaining the shortcomings of reductive moralizing categories, such as hero and villain. And what I've been arguing all along is that portraits offer excellent opportunities for doing just this. Now, I have a very short section where I try to bring this up to date. So in 1969, the National Portrait Gallery in London got rid of the rule which stated that a sitter had to have been dead for 10 years before an image of them could be considered for acquisition by the trustees. And by the way, Sargent's portrait of the officers of the First World War received a specific waiver because it was deemed this was of sufficient national importance to merit representing people who were still alive. Now, I can't yet prove this point statistically, but my impression is that there was little interest in military portraits from then, that is 1969, until the early 21st century. The gallery then acquired 3 works between 2006 and 2014 that relate to my arguments here, all depicting men who had come to prominence through their involvement with conflicts from the Middle East to the Falklands and Iraq. That is, men whose work may be considered highly controversial. And it is interesting that all 3 of them have written autobiographies. And of course, I hardly need to say in Belfast that this point about them being controversial applies above all to General Sir Mike Jackson, born in 1944, died in 2024, painted by Brendan Kelly in 2009, following his retirement from the army in 2006, where he had been General Chief of Staff since 2003. And as I said, his army record went back to Northern Ireland, where he had served in both the 1970s and the 1990s. Now, so far as I'm aware, there are no recent portraits of women in the armed forces in the National Portrait Gallery. And I think those of men remain profoundly gendered. I'm going to come in a moment to the other two men there. In the UK news recently, there has been the case of a young woman who killed herself following prolonged sexual harassment from her superior officer, someone who was responsible for her safety. And this is not the first such case. So I'm arguing here that public discourse around the army cannot avoid gender, whether implicitly or explicitly. The other two military portraits show men from the ranks. The recipient of the Victoria Cross, Johnson Bahari, on your left, born 1979 in Grenada, and the severely burned Falklands veteran Simon Weston, born 1961 on your right. It was Bahari's choice to be painted in his dress uniform by Emma Wesley, who was chosen by the staff of the National Portrait Gallery. He sustained permanent, debilitating injuries in Iraq in 2004. And we have much evidence about the process and about the artist's choices, including her intention that viewers should perceive allusions to a crown of thorns. And I'm quoting the artist here. The red lines of Bahari's uniform lead the eye to his headscars, and the military cap, a veiled reference to Christ's crown of thorns, represents his selfless sacrifice to save his colleagues. The manner in which clothing, medals, hat, and skin are depicted contribute to a striking image. Note, for example, the extremely unusual shape of the canvas, just over 84 by 33 centimetres. Nicky Phillips' portrait of Weston with brush marks following the shape of his scars I find extraordinarily poignant. He holds medals in his hand, there is a cap on the chair, and all these elements are doing their visual work. Now, Jackson, in the middle, professed himself very pleased with Kelly's rendering of him, but its mood of profound melancholy, I would argue, is inescapable. And he is the only senior military figure to enter the NPG in recent times, a very striking choice given his career. With rich supporting evidence, we can use such portraits to explore nuances of masculinity in what remains, despite the presence of women, the profoundly gendered realm of military service. And I think it's worth noting that Jackson's autobiography echoes Haig and Orpen's sentiments about the ordinary soldier. And his life and representations open up a wide range of issues about the public understanding of military activities. Now, actually, what makes all this possible is the visual intelligence of artists. To put it at its most simple, they are the primary mediators for public institutions. For the London National Portrait Gallery to continue to receive the public funding it is allocated, it must show that it can bring in diverse visitors and give them a valuable experience. While a recent rehang gives greatly enhanced prominence to female citizen artists, the acquisition of 3 works depicting men in the armed forces over 8 years is noteworthy. Even in situations where more conventional portraits are produced, artists remain crucial visual intermediaries. What they produce in dynamic interaction with their sitters is worthy of historians' close attention. Thus, public historians might see portrait artists as significant allies as well as subjects of interest. who can furnish the public with accessible, thought-provoking, but not simplistic material through which to understand the past. A past in which the dynamics between a range of other constituencies and elites can be fully explored. There's no doubt that there is something of a divide between those interested in the people with military and political power and those who respond more to so-called ordinary folk, the rank and file, if you like. This divide is visible in publishing and the media, where providers target specific audiences to serve their commercial goals. It also takes more cultural forms, for example, in the disdain I mentioned earlier for military history, insofar as it is received as buying into a fascination with technological power, reconstruction, and the doings of top dogs. And you will infer that I find such disdain regrettable. Military history done well, as by people such as Keith Jeffery, is of crucial importance for any understanding of past and present societies. So what I've done here is use the Orpen-Wilson encounter to think about portraiture more generally and its potential to be useful to public historians. Each such conjunction can, evidence permitting, be treated like a case history with its own specificities. And it is artists who are the key players here, since they are in control of visual media, and their relationship with sitters lies at the heart of portraits, which can speak to ages of anxiety. And in particular, I have suggested that William Orpen is an example of a portraitist whose work is relevant to public history, partly because of his generous, wide sympathies, given visual expression in his work during and immediately after World War I, and now housed in 2 national institutions. Depictions of military men can open up fruitful conversations about leadership and warfare, conversations that can transcend crude hero-villain polarities. Portraits, precisely because they are an accessible type of culture, act as portals to understanding the past. They demand of their makers, as they demand of those who use and view them subsequently, visual intelligence and sensibilities. The manner in which they mobilize semantic affinities make them invaluable in both public history and in the examination of our own practices as historians. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for a very fitting lecture this evening. I think everybody here appreciated it. We have a few moments before we're kicked out or locked in. So if anybody has any questions, we can probably take about 2. If you'd like to raise your hands, the mic will be on its way to you.
Thank you for the really great lecture. I'm curious if you have any suggestions for how you would best like to see portraits like this contextualized in public history and museum didactics. Just because personally, even when I view portraits like this, I have trouble identifying some of these important themes that you've laid out.
Quite a few examples. I think I gave quite a few examples of that. I mean, I think one will want to know how people knew each other, what kind of an encounter they had, what each one thought about the other. And the National Portrait Gallery in London has been collecting that kind of material for quite some time. And actually, obviously, it doesn't apply to all portraits. There are portraits where we simply don't know. But the fact is there are plenty of portraits where we know a huge amount. So in the National Portrait Gallery in London, there is the most amazing archive. It is not on the whole used by historians. Every item in the main collection has what's called a registered packet. In that registered packet is the kind of material that I've just been drawing on, where people talk about the encounter, what they're looking for. There are sometimes newspaper clippings that report the portrait. So that you know, there's a ton of stuff. And because Orpen, I mean, Orpen, you know, I don't want to sound like I'm an apologist for Orpen, but I do think he's extraordinarily interesting. And I'm surprised that people don't make more of him, because when he published his memoir in 1921, he's one of the first people to do that kind of writing. So actually, there are ways of contextualizing that are very, very evocative, I think, for all audiences, which will enable them to see these maybe what appears somewhat forbidding men in a much kind of richer contextual light. So the material is there. It's for us to do that work.
Yeah. Oh, right.
Thank you. Thank you for that beautifully rich lecture. I want to pick up on some of the intertwining themes. I'm reverberating here, should I put it back? And that's about the representation of anxiety within these portraits and the relationship to changing ideas and modalities of masculinity, and how that figures especially and prominently and very kind of dynamically, especially in these military portraits. So where do you see, or do you see any direct and very kind of obvious evidence of a greater openness, sensitivity, acceptance of mental fragility, and the outer expression of anxiety within the military context and kind of changing ideas of heroism, and especially male heroism?
Okay, so the first thing I would say is that anxiety isn't necessarily the term I would choose. And I tried to weave it in because that's the conference theme. But I do think the Mike Jackson portrait is absolutely extraordinary. And I was actually a trustee of the portrait gallery when that was both commissioned and unveiled. And I was one of the trustees who argued that since war has been such an important phenomenon, the portrait gallery should absolutely engage with it, which it really, I think, has turned itself away from. And then that portrait resulted. And I look at it and it makes me feel desperately sad. And, you know, as I argued, we have repertoire for understanding this. It's not possible, I don't think, given our current understanding of how people look and behave, not to look at that portrait and see profound sadness. And all I'm suggesting is that that's a way of opening up a conversation. So, I mean, I could have recast everything I've said in terms of the idiom of conversation, because in order to take a likeness from life, you have to have a conversation between artist and sitter. I don't know if that answers your question. I mean, I actually, myself, respond very strongly to the Haig portrait. And I know that Haig, as I kept trying to acknowledge, is a problematic figure in the First World War. But I find that an extraordinarily compassionate rendering of Haig. So rather than saying, you know, we know he did this on the Somme, that we look at something like that and we say, well, can that open up an understanding or a conversation that has perhaps slightly different idioms and less moralizing idioms in it? So, I mean, so I hope you'll forgive me. It's a rather long answer to your question, but that's the kind of, and I actually think that both the Bahari and the Western also suggest kinds of affect in the portrait. And there are hundreds of other examples that one could look at, but those are just so striking because they put the military front and center. And actually, what I really want to say is I can't bear the thought of my fellow historians being snooty about military history. It is so wrong. And I really have colleagues who, if you say the phrase military history, they go, can't become, and it's actually about everything that societies are. And if we can get people interested in having different kinds of conversations, different kinds of reflections through portraiture, that would be a good thing to do.
Well, I think you've given us a lot to think about over a glass of wine. We are now going to move to the Naughton Gallery, which is if you go into the black and white hall and it's up the stairs. But can we please once more thank our speaker for a wonderful, thought-provoking lecture.